All right, so we're going to kick off our next session, which is the last session before we're going to break for lunch and go to closing keynotes. Last but not least, of course. So, deployment of MFA or authentication mechanisms in the enterprise is complicated at best. Legacy systems, newer systems, you know. But the best person we have here to talk about that and how to look at authentication from the enterprise perspective is right here, and it's Bassam Al-Khalidi. He is the founder and co-CEO of Axiad. So welcome.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. My name is Bassam Al-Khalidi, co-founder and CEO of Axiad. Thank you for the introduction. Really appreciate it. I know I'm last man standing between this session and lunch, so I really appreciate you guys being here. Obviously, this is important enough that you guys are here, so we'll try to make it as informative as possible, and thank you for your time for attending. We really wanted to focus today on workforce. So a lot of the things that I'm going to be talking about what's best practice, what we've seen in the industry, what do we hear from our customers, is really that from that angle. So I want to be very clear on which angle we're walking through this presentation today. So if you guys have any questions, it's really around workforce. How can we help the enterprise go down this journey? So what is this journey that we are talking about, and what do we see, and what are the trends that we're starting to see today? The biggest trend that during these sessions that we've been hearing about is passwordless. Well, how do I move to passwordless? What are the challenges? Where I'm at today, and how am I going to get there? So what is the challenge today? I think that the key question is, what is the challenge? The second key question is, how did we get here? How did we get to this state that we are in today? So as we've gone through our digital transformation, as we've gone through our authentication journey over the years, what's happened is we started to fragment our approach towards authentication within the enterprise. So if we split it into 4 different areas, we'll talk about authentication methods, use cases, the ecosystem, and last but not least, the identity type. So if we start from the bottom right corner and go around, from the identity type, we've got people, we've got machines, and we've got APIs, and we've got a lot of different non-entities within the organization. If we go into authentication, of course, it's been passwords, and then we saw the big push towards MFA, and now we're trying to get rid of passwords and kind of leapfrog MFA and go into passwordless. Then we look at operating systems. Those also have, there's a big change in the last few years, right? Mac is becoming more and more within the ecosystem. The use of Linux is still big in the back end and infrastructure and in data centers. And of course, with Windows and mobile devices. So that all is expanding pretty rapidly. The hybrid workforce, if anything we saw in the last 2 years, the hybrid workforce is here to stay, right? The remote from the beginning to the end, onboarding process all the way to offboarding is pretty much happening remote these days. So that's a new challenge that's adding more to that fragmentation. Then we look at existing IAMs in the ecosystem. So as an organization, we might have started down the path of going down one vendor, then now Azure is really kicking up in gear. Now we want to use that. We have the legacy vendor, we have the new vendor, we buy another company through M&A, we get another third-party vendor, and it's really, really hard to consolidate all of them in a pretty rapid time. So what happens? We have to live with it, right? So what does that mean when we have to live with all this? It creates a few fundamental problems. The first one it creates is the low business productivity. So how so? Because now we have all these different systems, now we have to manage all these different systems, now we have to maintain them, and we have to maintain all their integration. That creates a pretty high level of overhead, not just on your users, but on the back end, on the administration side, on the help desk side. If we look at one of the biggest things we got back from our community was there's a lot of MFA fatigue today. Why? Because I use a Microsoft Authenticator to authenticate to X. I use a different authenticator to authenticate to Y. When I want to go to access something privileged, I got to go to my PAM, check out my password. I got to do this, I got to do that. And when something doesn't work and you're calling the help desk, well, now they have to go down a tree before they even help you. What are you using to authenticate? What application are you trying to authenticate to? And what did you use and why is it not working? So it's really creating that overhead across the board and creating that MFA fatigue across the board as well. Orphaned existing investments. As we start to look at plug-in holes, while we are doing this here, we need to do something equivalent here and then here. So how do we plug these holes? We start buying different point solutions to solve a point-in-time problem. And then now we have another orphan system that we have to manage and maintain to support this limited use case. It adds to the whole high administration cost and, of course, the low business productivity. Last but not least, as we started to add all these different infrastructure and as it becomes a burden to manage them, what happens is it creates new risk vectors. So what is our perspective on this? So we're looking at it from an angle of we need to shift the discussion. We need to shift it from I have all these multiple disjointed silos. It's really inflexible to all integrate them all together into one platform. Why? Because it's extremely complex and then it becomes really expensive. So how do we solve it? We're solving it by adding a lot of manual workflows to our team so that they can address it. And from there, by adding all these manual workflows, we're adding a lot of overhead to our teams across the board. Then it creates a new risk in different areas of how are we managing our access to the keys to the kingdom within their environments. So how do we solve this problem? So we need to look at it of how are we going to unify this approach? How are we going to come down to a single way to move forward to have a way that I can integrate this, I can unify it, I can make it highly adaptive, and I can automate now workflows and make sure that it's transparent across the board. It's important to lock down every single use case. We've heard it over the last 2 days. What I love about this conference is it talks about real talk, right? It talks about real problems. We want to go to the password. So I'm not going to bring up all the passwordless challenges because we've heard it in the sessions prior to this. But these are concrete problems. There's concrete paths forward, right? Especially with FIDO and how we plan to address it. But we also need to be realistic that how are we going to address all the problems across the board? And other speakers have talked about it. They've talked about, well, what are we going to do about recovery? What are we going to do about this? What are we going to do about that? So what does that mean? Does that mean we stand still and we wait until we get to that end state? We need to be flexible enough that we can adopt the new technology as quickly as possible while managing our existing risk and have a path forward to get to the end state that we want to get to. So let's look at some concrete applications. How are we going to do that? So first thing we want to do is we want to make sure that we empower our end users to be able to do everything themselves. When I talk about our end users, I talk about across the board. That's help desk, that's administrators, operators, end users, contractors. We really have to empower them down the passwordless journey. That means they should be able to do everything themselves. Now, the moment we say that they need to be able to do everything themselves, then new challenges come up. If we're going to let them do anything and everything, well, how are we going to verify their identity? How are we going to do identity proofing? That becomes a big key challenge in a remote workforce environment, right? So we really need to tackle that as well. But once we empower our users, and then we can enhance our automation systems behind it. So what does that mean? That means now I can have, if the user is going to a single location to get any type of credential that they need, and then they have that streamlined process, now when I have an issue, when I'm trying to authenticate to anything, now it's a simple, when I call help desk or I reach out or I need assistance, now it becomes a really simple thing of saying, well, I'm trying to authenticate to X. Now as a help desk, because I have that single pane of glass, I can see all the users or authenticators at the same time in one single pane of glass and be able to help them right there in the spot in a pretty streamlined environment. But if we pause here on enhanced administration, so far, I haven't told you anything new. We're saying that we need to make it simple, make it turnkey, make it automation. All these are just medicine to the disease. How do we cure the problem at its core? Why do we need to contact help desk? What is the event that a user needs to contact help desk? The event is something's wrong with their token. And when they contact help desk, it's because they don't know how to solve it. So that goes back to empowering the end user. Well, if we can give the end user a simple way to self-help, self-diagnose, and self-move forward, and cure the problem before it even happens, then isn't that a better path forward? If they never need to contact anyone to help themselves, isn't that a better process? Wouldn't you have better customer satisfaction from your end user? Better security, right? So let's look at an application of how that would look like. If I'm an end user, something's wrong with my authenticator, if I can just go in quickly and simply, and then just say, I can proof my identity right there on the spot, then it would give me a workflow and an automated workflow on how I can update, fix, change, request, recover, whatever that may be, right there on the spot. So from a user perspective, that's very powerful, because I feel like I'm in control not only of my identity, but I'm also in control of my authenticator, of my digital identity. Why is that important? Because now from a productivity standpoint, we eliminated the need to go to help desk, that time that it takes, and eliminated the human error aspect of social engineering, somebody calling the help desk, trying to impersonate that person. And it really empowers the end user to do everything himself. So powering end user, enhanced administration. If we're going to go down this route, we need to make sure that everyone is using a phishing-resistant MFA. Don't get me wrong. Just using passwords, adding any MFA is great. It's a great step forward. Anything is better than a password. So a good starting point, if you have nothing, an MFA is a great starting point. It's better than not having anything. But we really want to move to a phishing-resistant MFA. So using authenticating like a FIDO2 authenticator, fantastic. As we've been hearing in the last couple of days, how the token is secure, it's easy to use with new additions, with passkey and other options. It's going to make the FIDO2 token really usable across the board. Whether I'm using a Roman token, whether I'm using a platform token, we're really going to see in the workforce the ability to use a FIDO2 token across the board. But today we're not there yet. So what does that mean? Does that mean we halt our FIDO2 implementation until we have everything underneath the sun that we need today for our workforce, for our enterprise? No. It means we need to move forward with what we have today and make sure that we fill in the gaps with other technologies, but give the user a consistent experience so that when we go to the path of zero trust, we're already on that journey. So what would that look like today? So that means if I'm a user and I try to authenticate to application A, if I'm entering a PIN or a biometric, if the underlying technology behind the scenes is passwordless, whether it's using a FIDO key or not today, because FIDO2 may not be applicable at this moment in time, but if I have my users used to this experience, this passwordless experience, as I can make FIDO prevalent across every single one of my authentication applications, then it becomes a really easy transition. From an endpoint, from a user standpoint, they just authenticate. It's passwordless authentication. Where I can use FIDO, I use FIDO. Where I can't use FIDO, we use a different passwordless technology behind the scenes to make that happen and make sure that we can cover all the different use cases. So how does Axiad help with that journey? So we looked at all these challenges and we looked at all this fragmentation and we said, well, this is a big problem to solve. So we looked at it, well, we said, step one, if we're going to solve this problem, we can't ask people to move their keys to the kingdom to the cloud and inherit new risk. Well, what is the first big risk of moving to the cloud? Well, the first big risk is you go on, you have everything protected in your environment, now you go to the cloud and now you're in a multi-tenant, right? Unfortunately, this is becoming the norm, going to a multi-tenant. Well, we didn't want to do the norm. We didn't want to do the status quo. We wanted to do something better. And based on our history and working with the Department of Defense and working with the federal government, we looked at best practices and we looked at how can we make this happen? And the first thing we decided to do is, well, we're going to tackle it in a different way and give everyone their virtual private cloud. In that virtual private cloud, you have everything's locked down and secure for your organization. So moving to the cloud, we're now inheriting a lot of new risks in there. From a security, obviously SOC 2, that goes without saying, all the other audits and controls without saying, but we're even going beyond and adding FedRAMP to it to ensure that we have even more. So hopefully we'll have FedRAMP by Q1 2023. But if we look at inside of it, inside that bubble that you would have, what are the elements that would solve the business problems that I was just talking about? One, a dedicated PKI as a service. PKI is very complex to deploy. And that's why we see the promise of FIDO2 addressing this problem down the road. But we want to be able today to give that passwordless user experience, not a passwordless experience. Actually, let me pause here for a second. The word passwordless is thrown a lot, and I want to make sure that we're all on the same page. There's passwordless experience, and there's true passwordless. Passwordless experience means I go in and I authenticate, and I don't have to enter my password, but then the application behind the scene is leveraging a password to authenticate. That's a passwordless experience. A best example of that is, you leverage Face ID, for example, on your iOS device. And when you come up to authenticate, you put your Face ID. So I'm interacting in a passwordless way, but behind the scenes, the application is going into my keychain, grabbing the credentials, the username and password, and submitting it to the application, right? So that's a passwordless experience. True passwordless means if I use a FIDO2 token, for example, when I go to authenticate, after I do my proof of possession, whether it's a PIN or biometric, then I'm leveraging the FIDO2 key to do a secure authentication, not submitting a password behind the scenes based on crypto. So that's why we want to make every transaction a true passwordless experience. With anything that we can do today with a FIDO2 token, we will do. Anything that we cannot do today with a FIDO2 token, we'll augment it with a PKI authentication. But we need to make it simple for the end user. So let's look at how do we make it simple from both the end user perspective, from an administration perspective, and from a day-to-day perspective. So the first thing we did is making sure that the enterprise, regardless of its size, can have an enterprise level PKI as a service turnkey. Up and running in 42 minutes at enterprise level, can address a global deployment. So that's step one, make it easy. Okay, the easy button. Step two, having an authentication service that can accept any type of authenticator that we can throw at it, whether it's a traditional MFA, whether it's SMS, email, FIDO2, PKI. Step three, orchestrate the authentication for the end user. What do I mean by that? That means when we issue the credential to the user, we issue multiple authenticators for the same user at the same time, and then orchestrate that authentication. So let's do an actual application of that. Let's say, for example, I grab a USB token, whether it's from Yubico, from Fetian, from all these different manufacturers that are here that are FIDO2 certified, and let me grab that token and issue it. What we do in this context is we enable all the different aspects of this key. So we'll load a certificate for authentication on the PKI as part of an X509 certificate on the secure element. We'll assign the FIDO2 token, and we'll also assign the OTP portion of it as well. So now, as a user, when I go log into my Windows, Mac, and Linux, if they're not FIDO2 enabled yet, because there are some limitations there, guess what? The user experience is identical. I enter my biometric, or I enter my PIN, and I can passwordless, true passwordless, secure authenticate to my desktop. I go to a web application, or I go to another third-party application that can accept a FIDO2 token, it will automatically use my FIDO2 token and use it. So now, as a user, I'm authenticating in a true passwordless across the board to all my different applications, whether it's RDP, VDI, VPN, web application, and Win32 application. I can truly say that I'm really going down the path of passwordless across the board. So what does it solve? So now we've gone from that fragmented approach to that really single platform approach. It gives the opportunity now for me to look at all these different authentication methods and not do a big bang approach. Some applications may not be ready to accept a FIDO2 token or an X509 authentication. Today, all they can do, they're limited. Maybe they don't support modern authentication. All they can support today is an MFA, traditional MFA. Well, we have to support that as well. But at the same time, we have to give a path forward how to do that today and how to migrate that to a passwordless authentication. The orchestration becomes the key point. Because once you go full, true passwordless across the board, not having an orchestration mechanism that you can handle all the different use cases New account, recovery, change name, moving different locations, travel, online, offline. You have to be able to solve the gambit. If you can't solve the gambit, you cannot be true passwordless. Last but not least, make sure you do not do the 80-20 rule. I've heard this a lot. The 80-20 rule is, well, my majority of the users do X. So I'm going to focus on that. This is the start of the fragmentation path, right? The moment we say, I'm going to solve the majority of my use cases, rather than saying, I am going to look at all my use cases, and if a platform cannot support all my use cases, that's not the right one for me, that's the first path or the first brick towards a fragmented approach. Why? Because I grab a platform that supports my 80, 90% of my use cases, and that's a phenomenal path forward. It's fantastic, it's great. But it starts the fragmentation because then after I finish that project, I start looking at the other use cases. Because we go through audits and compliance and this comes up and it says, well, this hasn't been handled. Then I go back to what I have, it doesn't support it. Because I did the 80-20 or 90-10 or 70-30, whatever it is. So then now I have to get other solutions that address these other use cases. The path to fragmentation is starting, right? Because sometimes that one solution that you get might not even solve the whole 10% or 20% that you have left. Then you might have to look for another solution, and so on. The path continues of fragmentation. Automation. Automation becomes extremely key in this. If we can't automate that user experience on a day-to-day from their whole life cycle, then you won't get the adoption rate that you want. You want to make it so simple for you, the end user, that they start promoting it internally and saying, hey, did you get to your passwordless solution? Because this is great. Once you get to that where your internal community starts to advocate and say, I love it. I don't even know what my passwords anymore. I just use this. That's it. I have no idea. The last time I reset my password was the day that I got my Authenticator, and I've never had to reset it again because I don't know what it is. I can't reset it even if I wanted to. They become your advocate internally to push into this passwordless solution. You can only do that when you get to passwordless enterprise-wide. Last but not least, leverage as much as you can from AI and ML, continuous access, continuous authentication. Again, other speakers over the last 2 days talked about this a lot. Identity signals, that is fantastic. Start with a passwordless roadmap and make sure you have a roadmap for that as well. So, kind of if we look at it, if we sum up, making sure you have that one single platform that you can address across the board, not just your users, but your machines. It's important that you not only know the user what authenticator he's using to authenticate, but to know what device or where they're coming from. That's important too. So device authentication or device registration becomes a really key part of this process as well. Integration, ensuring that whatever platform you have needs to plug and play. So from our perspective, obviously, we can provide the gambit, but even from our perspective, we look at it and we would never say, hey, you need to do this as a big bang approach. That's suicidal. We don't want you to do that. What we will not look at is what current investments you've made, what's the ROI on these investments, things that are working really well, let's plug and play. Over the next 3 to 5 years, look at that consolidated roadmap and look at how can you move to that single platform. Automation, I talked about that a lot, but visibility. Having a single pane of glass of knowing which authenticators that your users have across the board, not just from X environment or Y environment. So I'll give you a concrete example. No matter which solution you buy, you might end up being forced, if you want to go, for example, Windows Hello for Business route, you might be being forced to have a Microsoft Authenticator. So now I have solution X with its own authenticators, whether it's passwordless MFA. I have a Microsoft Authenticator. Now we just, again, added to that fragmentation. Having a single pane of glass for your help desk when they log in and be able not only to see the authentication methods from product A, but also be able to see the authentication methods that the same user are registered with a different platform, let's say from Azure, really gives you that single pane of glass to see, okay, you're having a problem, you have this, but I also know you have this authenticator. I can have you use this one to authenticate yourself right now. So it gives you more flexibility, leveraging the existing investment that you've made. And it gives you control over that credential, even if it's coming from different platforms. I know I'm running out of time, so I hope I stayed within the time slots that I have available. Really appreciate your time. We have a booth down in the main hall, so if you just walk in, we'll be on your left-hand side. And really excited about what we are, and everyone here today in this conference, what we're doing with FIDO2, and really leveraging FIDO2 as much as we can to get to a full passwordless state across the board for users and machines. So it's very exciting, and thank you for your time.